and it is my distinct pleasure to declare this an essential meeting, not a non-essential meeting. Our subject today is Iran protests and U.S. responses, but of course, since we have two such expert and distinguished speakers, we're going to range far more widely than that. Everything is on the table, including the Iran nuclear deal and Iran's ambitions, its wider ambitions in the Middle East, and its relations with the United States. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who is currently Vice Chairman of Hills and Company. And he has obviously had a long and distinguished career spanning 5 decades as an American diplomat. And I won't go through the whole his curriculum vitae because most of you probably already know him. I will say that he holds the personal rank of career ambassador, the highest in the U.S. Foreign Service. To my right is Reul Marc Gerecht, who I have read now, I think, for several decades, everywhere from the Atlantic to the Weekly Standard. He was previously at the American Enterprise Institute and is now a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. I look forward to a lively and spirited discussion, and with that, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Pickering.
Thank you, Jacob, very much, and it's a pleasure to join all of you in the interesting situation where increasingly the free lunch is an attractive alternative in Washington, at least for the time being. Let's hope it's a reasonably short time. I'm delighted to join Reul. If any of you have not read, Reul, I don't know whether you published it, the story of your, I guess, most recent arrival in Iran. But it's a interesting and indeed fascinating synopsis of a operations officer, Monkey at the time, practicing the tradecraft when the visa was clearly unavailable. In any event, it's a pleasure to join him and obviously all of you. I want to talk a little bit about the protests and a little bit about the JCPOA, and then a little bit for those of you who are not totally tired of hearing me on the question of what we might do in the future. What are some of the options in the future in that latter category, since we're facing a deadline, the clock on which is ticking for a 180-day finding from a couple of weeks ago. The protests, in my view, were interesting. They began clearly in the countryside. They failed to spread in an intensive way to the major cities and towns, particularly Tehran, where I think they would have had a great deal more significant effect. Most analysis is that they came out of what are clearly difficult economic conditions in Iran, perhaps multiplied by frustration and failure with the Rouhani government being able to produce what seemed to be, for some, a potential pot of gold at the end of the JCPOA rainbow, none of which I think has eventuated, although clearly Iran's economy has improved to some extent. The reason why they failed, I think, to catch hold in the cities is a little harder to fathom, perhaps because the cities are doing well, or at least doing better economically and where things are going. It is difficult for me to believe that the Trump administration reaction was really much different than the Obama administration reaction, which was basically highly unlikely to be able to affect things, and perhaps in the Trump case, diversion and interest in lots of other problems going on at the same time, which pulled some of their capacity away. I can remember as a young Foreign Service officer and before dealing with the Soviets over Berlin and Hungary, and then later over Czechoslovakia, as it was then known, and the clear sense that despite the fact that many had stood up and beat their chests about engaging the United States militarily as the Soviet Empire seemed to be coming apart in its occupation of East Europe, there was really no one, I think, who, particularly in the military part of the U.S. government, who thought it was wise or that we were capable or there was a real answer in engaging. And so we dealt with refugees. We used what we could in the information warfare side, and we watched as things unrolled and things happened. This particular set of protests went downhill a lot faster than 2009, where I think a deep mobilization of Basij and the Revolutionary Guard played a significant role in beating that one into submission. And clearly, one was impressed by the fact that for a couple of weeks on dark nights, rooftops echoed with the Persian Margaba Dictator, death to the dictators. And that never, I think, really caught hold in this one, although there were clearly complaints about Khamenei as well as Rouhani. Interestingly enough, this morning's news carries an announcement by the Minister of Defense, who is not, for the first time, a Revolutionary Guard general, who has made the declaration, obviously on behalf of the Supreme Leader, that the Revolutionary Guard and the military should get out of economic activity not directly linked to their own national security interests. And one would imagine they would therefore stay in things like arms manufacture and similar relationships. How far that direct relationship issue will stretch and how much will actually be done is obviously open to question, as are all things in Iran. But it is interesting that the protests have had at least that kind of a reaction at the top level in Iran, and we'll see where that particular issue goes. And segueing to the JCPOA, it was fascinating the degrees of cleverness in American press commentators under which they attacked the issue of whether the JCPOA would be, in fact, killed by the protests, or it should be left alone because the protests were dying anyway, or similar, and I think interesting, analyses of that sort. It appeared to me to be more than usually tortured in an effort to try to figure out the answer to that particular problem. Others around the table may have a different view, and obviously I'd be interested in hearing it. But at the moment, it seems as if, in fact, that the protests have come, seemingly gone, absent some new trigger that sets off a new round or expands them, and that the JCPOA remains out there one way or another as a major problem to deal with. Let me wind up by saying, as I have to other groups, that I think that my own sense is that the JCPOA should be something that it's in the U.S. national interest to preserve, not that, in fact, it is the total answer for all time to our concerns about Iran's nuclear interests. And what concerns me the most, and has for some time, is the sunset provisions, particularly the one that opens up the possibility of producing an unlimited amount of low-enriched uranium, seemingly as a stockpile, or to meet Iran's enriched fuel needs for the Bushehr reactor and perhaps its successors. That's sometime in the future, so we have roughly a 10, 11, even 12-year deadline hovering over us. In the short term, we now have the new Trump deadline, and I think that it's interesting that one detects some talk around in three different tracks. The one, and the first one that I think is interesting, and perhaps more in the arms control non-proliferation round, is what our old friend Bob Einhorn has written about changing the goalposts and how one might deal with that. I had, with some humility, contributed an earlier piece in March in Survival on a longer-term way to deal with the particular question of where to go, but with the idea in mind that negotiations would not begin for some time and absorb quite a bit of time, particularly given Iran's absolutely, at this stage, complete opposition to opening up any kind of negotiation on the nuclear side, although Zarif has been quoted by the press as saying he was prepared to talk about missiles and missile testing at various times. No one has yet taken him up on that. The second track, I think, is interesting. Let me just say that with respect to the first track and the longer term, the idea here is not to try to go and amend the JCPOA, but keep it in place. And follow it on with an international agreement aimed at NPT parties, but particularly those with the capacity to enrich uranium and over time separate plutonium from spent fuel, and to use the Iran agreement as the gold standard for that with some necessary adjustments, and to base that on the 5 recognized nuclear powers in the NPT, each of which has a unilateral moratorium in place and has had for some 15 to 20 years on making fissionable material for use in nuclear weapons. And so that basis might give you a starting point. The second piece here is something that is a little more tricky. What did the president mean with his 4-month deadline? The implication was that Iran had to come around by then. But another implication was that maybe Europeans and the U.S. and other players might be together on a set of ideas by that 4-month period, although that's less easy to grab. In some cases, it's like the famous 2 Khrushchev letters in the Cuban Missile Crisis, take the one you like. If that were something that was useful and possible, I think it's reachable, either a set of principles or an outline of what might be done as a way to improve for a longer period of time the JCPOA. I had put one suggestion on the table. Bob Einhorn has another, at least as an intermediate, and one could see some blending of those ideas. The third question is obviously of our own making, INARA. INARA was clearly put in to torture a Democratic president and perhaps a successor as a Democrat. It has now had the unusual effect of torturing a Republican president. And one can see absolutely no value in the findings that are put into INARA if, in fact, as we know, both the IAEA and the U.S. intelligence community is capable of making a judgment about Iran compliance. So why not substitute that for the time periods in INARA and get this burden off President Trump's back, a burden he's uncomfortable with and unable to do anything, in fact, that represents anything but fake findings on that particular set of issues. And that kind of a new piece of legislation could certainly take the finding about Iran's compliance off as an amendment to INARA, and with a notwithstanding clause, take the 180-day and 120-day findings out of the sanctions legislation that currently exists. What would you substitute it for? Well, the Hillists talk about triggers, and I think triggers is not a bad idea. How do you define triggers, obviously, is the devil with all the details. But if the triggers were found as a material breach, and you left room open, as we have now, for the Joint Commission in a particular period of time, maybe 90 days, to solve any differences, as it has been doing with Iran over pieces of Iranian activity not absolutely clearly defined in the JCPOA, you might have something that would be useful and helpful on this particular issue. A finding then by the intelligence community of a material breach unrepaired in the 90 days, under which the Congress might also, since they want a role in everything, have their own option to decide whether they would waive sanctions or fail to waive sanctions, would be an interesting piece of legislation. It certainly would assure that we have the time we would need to deal with an Iranian violation. And while it would put back on the table, as I think is absolutely necessary, the potential for the use of force. It's clearly something the Obama administration said it was prepared to do. I can't imagine Trump is anything less. That might provide a useful way to proceed for us, protecting our interests, and it might even fulfill something the president is preoccupied by, a campaign promise with respect to the JCPOA. So let me quit while you're still awake.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Reul.
Should I pull that over
Yeah.
or should I just bellow out?
You can just both.
Oh, okay, I'll bellow. Let me just start with a few comments about the demonstrations. I mean, I would say that the Islamic Republic has been dying since the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. If you go back and you look, the first major incidents of riots occurred in 1989 after his death. It was over a soccer match, canceled soccer match in Tehran, which led to 10,000 young men going out on the streets and mischievously yelling, "Long live the Taj." The Taj used to be the name of the Istiklal soccer team. It also means in Persian, the crown. That it was when the riot control forces of the Revolutionary Guard / Basij were formed. Now, to collapse history a bit, I think it's fair to say that the regime in Tehran is well aware that they have lost the college educated. This is a real loss for them because if you remember, the cutting edge of the revolution was in fact the college educated. It was not a peasant revolution, it was not a Mustazafan revolution, it was a college educated revolution. But if you have one common denominator of all those who joined the Green movement, the pro-democracy movement that nominally had Mousavi and Karoubi at the top, it is how much higher education you have. They know that. Now, what happened recently was, to some extent, a suggestion that they've also lost the Mustazafan, the weak, the oppressed. Now, I wouldn't go too far on that because the real truth about the Islamic Republic, and they put out, quite decent figures on these things, is that the universities in Iran have been pushing out roughly 1 to 1.5 million graduates per year. Lots of those graduates who are essentially poorly educated and close to being unemployable, have been going many places, not just Tehran. They come from all over the spectrum, the social spectrum of the Islamic Republic, so the dissatisfaction that the college educated, all of those acute feelings that college educated people have that we think that the poor do not, it has seeped through the system, has seeped through society everywhere in the Islamic Republic. And if you think of how large Iranian families are, their extended families, you can get up into the millions and millions and millions of people who are deeply, deeply frustrated, and I would argue are quite tired of theology. I strongly recommend for those who have the inclination, there's a very fine book out. It's not the greatest literary work, but its value is elsewhere, to read Misach Parsa's book, Democracy in Iran. It's a wonderful little description of what has happened inside of the country since 1979. I don't think the Trump administration obviously was not prepared for these demonstrations the same way the Obama administration was not prepared for the demonstrations in 2009. I might add that I don't think the demonstrations spread to Tehran in significant numbers because one, the regime had anticipated more demonstrations in Tehran, and that's where it keeps the bulk of its security forces. I do not think the economy has significantly improved in many regions of Tehran. I think that's a myth, particularly in the south. So the Trump administration obviously is not an administration that easily lends itself to advancing a pro-democracy agenda in the Middle East. It's certainly not its cup of tea. I would say that Iran is one of those few places that President Trump really doesn't have any rhetorical liabilities, though, that his mannerisms, his approach would be satisfactory in Iran. I might add, just as an amusing side note, that before I came here, I was looking at a photo that my good friend Ray Takier had sent me, which shows Donald Trump, Jack Nicholson, and Warren Beatty in Tehran in 1978. And the mind runs wild just thinking of what those three men got up to. I do think that the president is perhaps at a turning point. If you'd asked me before the last volcanic meeting on Iran in the White House, if you'd asked me, would the President of the United States eventually punt on the JCPOA, I would have said he would have. That I thought there was more bluster and noise there than reality. I thought you would have, in fact, some type of symmetry develop between the approach to the JCPOA and the President's approach to pushing back Iran regionally, which, of course, has been near zero. The administration really hasn't done anything in Syria and Iraq. There even have been discussions inside of the administration about drawing down forces in Iraq. There is no, that I have seen, there is no great desire on the part of the President, and I suspect that extends to General Mattis, if not General McMaster, to be much more aggressive in the region. I think the rhetoric that you've gotten from the administration about using other forces, be they Kurds or Sunni Arabs, isn't serious. It's not going to happen. I think at best what the administration is doing is they're denying Iran and the Russians all of the strategic points in Syria, that at best it is a weak holding action, hoping that something better will come around the corner. So I'd expect it actually to have some coherence, some logic. I think that obviously is not necessarily the approach that you wish to take with the President. It appears to be now that May 12th will in fact be D-Day, that the administration is either going to accept the JCPOA or it is going to walk away from it, or essentially set up requirements that are going to down it. I believe that is actually the understanding amongst the Republican leadership on the Hill. So we are going to have an interesting scenario develop, I think, fairly quickly. I was recently in Europe, and I think the consensus amongst the Europeans is they didn't have to worry about Donald Trump. That he had more or less de facto accepted the JCPOA, that we were primarily having to deal with rhetoric, that when it came to the pivotal issues, the Boeing and the Airbus deals, that he was going to let them go through. I would argue that Boeing and Airbus are in fact the pivotal issues. If they go through, then you are unlikely to see a serious wave of sanctions from the administration. If they go down, then the possibilities of serious sanctions on a whole variety of issues, particularly on the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which of course isn't withdrawing from the Iranian economy, could be conceivably quite substantial. So far, we have not seen those administration. The administration certainly has, in its ammunition dump, a huge amount of information on sanctionable activities by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. It has a very good idea of all the companies they use, where they are, who's involved. And for the most part, so far, I think we have seen what some have called junk food designations. That is, sanctions that make you feel good but don't have really any nutritional value. That could change. It's entirely possible that could change after the 12th of May. We could, in fact, have this very contradictory situation develop where the United States does little on the ground to deter Iranian hegemony in the Middle East, but it does, in fact, take down the JCPOA either explicitly or de facto. So I am inclined now to, as I said, to sort of wind back the tape, and I think the Europeans are going to do what the Europeans have been doing. That is, they're going to work the Democratic Party very hard. They are going to reach out to certain Republicans that they believe are sympathetic, and they're going to try to come up with something that gives the appearance of doing something real without it really being terribly provocative, in the hopes that the president really does want to punt and that he'll accept it because he too wants to avoid the Iran imbroglio. Inaro would be a part of that. You would want to get that red flag out of the president's face. So I don't think that the standards that Tom suggests are real. Anytime anyone tells me that the CIA is going to be used to judge Iran, I just shiver and shudder. But I suspect that will be one of the alternatives that they will suggest. I'm not sure that's going to fly, but I know that the Europeans and the Democrats are going to work very, very hard to come up with some ideas, and they will obviously pick up a few Republicans too, because the truth be told, the Republicans, I think, are really no more eager to run into the convulsion that's going to occur after the JCPOA code goes down. That it has become clearer that the opposition they had to President Obama's diplomacy, it was in part an opposition, I think, to his concessionary approach, which sprang from what is certainly clear, and that is the president was unwilling to back diplomacy with force. But it also sprang from the fact that the Republicans didn't want to go there either. So this is going to be a test, I think, for Hill Republicans. It will be a test for Senator Cotton, who is, I think, probably one of the more hawkish individuals in the Senate and somewhat influential with the president. So we will have to see. I expect it to be the road ahead to be much more convulsive than it has been so far. I suspect the president may not punt. And I would just end by saying that if more sanctions actually occur and we start to see the return of really targeted sanctions against the Guard Corps, then the situation inside of Iran might also start to become more interesting. I would say it remains interesting all the time. I think the thing that one always has to have in the back of the mind is that Iran is always on a slow boil. It is always hot lava ready to go. The regime knows that, which is one reason I would argue that if we really had the desire to go for the jugular against the Islamic Republic, now would be the time to do so. But again, I suspect that is not the case with the Trump administration, and I'll stop there.
Well, I will thank you very much. If we don't go for the jugular, we can always go for the capillaries. But I want to pose the first question to both our speakers. Are we guilty of some national solipsism here, which is, if you talked about the CIA shivering and shuddering, but are the Europeans...
I'm shivering and shuddering.
Right. Well, okay, shivering. Would the Europeans simply shrug if the United States pulls out of the Iran deal? The Iran deal is not necessarily dependent. The United States can pull out and have more freedom of maneuver, but does it ultimately end up simply isolating the United States? Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Back in the early days of the Clinton administration, the Treasury was asked, at the time we renegotiated with the Europeans the impact of ILSA, the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. What would they support in the way of secondary sanctions against Europeans who violated ILSA? And their answer was quite clear. It will totally destroy the international financial system and over a long period of time lead to the substitution of other currencies for the world reserve currency than the dollar. It's not a good idea. That hangs out there a little bit now because, in fact, with the JCPOA to go down, and with doing anything that would prevent our total isolation, we would have to exercise rather extensive secondary sanctions against the Europeans who want to continue to trade. And so that's a nasty result. My own view is that in most places, they don't see early substitution of yen or renminbi or euros for the dollar. Whether, however, the continuation along those lines would lead to that consequence is an open question. I don't know that it would, but I don't know that it wouldn't. But it would clearly end up, even if that were a contested question, in significant political tensions between the United States and Europe and more. And that would lead to isolation. So if the president's objective in destroying JCPOA in as far as the U.S. is concerned is to get something better, and sanctions are the first alternative route, followed by use of force after it, we're likely to be alone and fairly weak in the leverage we have. It's a me-lie problem. We're killing the leverage that is most useful for us to get the result by carrying out the campaign promise. And it gives you a significant insight into the president's deep sense of incapacity about strategy and about how to move diplomatic negotiations. The other thing I can say is that at the same time, freeing up Iran, while we screw around, if I could put it this way, with sanctions and the Europeans, to start turning centrifuges as rapidly as they can and go back to 20% enrichment and maybe 40 and then now 60 and 80, is in my view not the best of all possible ideas that are out there. So while we're subtracting our leverage to get a better result, we're empowering the violator freely to go down the road of violation at an even more aggressive pace. A great idea whose time will never come.
Reul, what's your take?
I can only dream of the Iranians actually starting to reconnect the centrifuges and up the enrichment percentage. I dream of that day. I think it's probably unlikely. You know, the Europeans, the truth is most European banks remain extremely cautious about investing in Iran. Even the major companies, Total exempted, are even Total, I think, are concerned about the political viability of their investments, economic viability of their investments in Iran because of lingering sanctions and also because of the simple nature of the Iranian marketplace. I don't think it would take too much on the part of this administration to essentially shut off most of the likely large European investment in the Islamic Republic. I think it is unlikely that produces a trade war. I don't think the European Union would have the consensus to desire a trade war over what is a really rather small amount of money for them when it comes to the United States. It's possible. I mean, I don't want to underestimate the Trump administration's possibility to screw this up. So it is possible that they could misplay this hand, and needless to say, there aren't that many Europeans who care for President Trump. So you could draw out scenarios where at the end of this, you actually do develop some type of trade war over the Islamic Republic. I don't think it's likely. And I suspect there is sufficient diplomatic talent left in this administration to avoid that. I would argue that if you could rewind the tape, the best thing the administration could have done was to send the correct signals early on, particularly the Airbus deal, to let the Europeans know clearly that this was not going to go. But that's not what the president did. I mean, I'm still most amused If you go back and you look, you'll see General McMaster giving a speech advising the Europeans to stay away from those sectors of the economy where the Revolutionary Guard Corps is heavily invested, which of course is all the strategic sectors the Europeans want to go into. And then literally, I think it was the next day, the president gives an interview to Fox News where he says, I've been talking to Merkel and Macron and telling them, oh, go ahead, invest, we don't need your help. Now, those two statements, speeches, are obviously an absolute contradiction. There is no economic coercion of the Islamic Republic without secondary sanctions against European businesses. That's just simply a fact. So, you know, if the administration is going to go down this path, then they should do this, signal this sooner, not later. If they wait and maintain the contradictions that they have indulged so far, then it's possible they will get themselves into a real pickle.
George Beebe was first off the draw.
Thank you. I think American political culture has a tendency to believe that the arc of history bends toward progress. And if a heinous regime somewhere in the world is under threat and is ultimately replaced, that what follows is going to be an improvement in some way. And I think there's ample reason to question whether that is in fact proved correct, certainly in recent history. And it has, I think, real implications for how we handle the situation in Iran and the instances of domestic unrest that we're seeing there. Is there a middle way that we could pursue encouraging evolutionary change in countries like this, and in Iran in particular, so that we don't see some sort of violent or abrupt change of regime there, which usually results in instability and seldom results in liberal governance thereafter. But countries that have managed to evolve in a more liberal direction seem to have better prospects. If we take that as an objective, evolutionary liberalization of that regime, what would U.S. policy look like to try to promote that?
Reul, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't think that's possible in the Islamic Republic. In fact, that is the argument, the theme of Misach Parsa's book, and he goes to look at those regimes that have evolved and the regimes that come down in revolution or counter-revolution. Islamic Republic is clearly in that other category. I think there was the hope, certainly amongst Iranians in the 1990s. That was why the reform movement developed. It was a movement of the revolutionary left in Iran, if I may so use that phrase. It's always a little dangerous to use left and right in the Islamic Republic, but we are trapped in the English language, so I'll use that. That wanted to believe that you could evolve the regime, that you could somehow get enough folks on what we call hardliners to accept the idea that the Islamic Republic needed to pass into Thermidor, and that you could have a kinder, if not a more democratic, Islamic Republic. Needless to remind you of history, those folks got stuffed. The death knell of the reform movement was actually the election of Rouhani in 2013. I mean, he was more or less killed off officially in 2009, 2010. The Supreme Leader himself, along with Jafari, the Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, they were quite honest in private speeches that have leaked out that, you know, the 2009, in their own words, was a near-death experience. They have learned, I think, those lessons. The Supreme Leader, by the way, is actually a reasonably decent student of history. He particularly has looked at the collapse of the Soviet Union. I suspect part of that interest came from his early love affair with Russian literature. He's actually much better with European literature than he is with Islamic law. So I believe that is highly unlikely. I don't see any chance of that happening, and I think that's why you see people on the streets in 2009, 2000 again, and 2010, and again most recently, chant against the regime itself, against Khamenei, against Rouhani, against the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and now, much disconcerting to the regime, against the Shiite chauvinism, this imperialism, which Iran has now launched itself into. I don't think you'll find there is much hope that this system is going to evolve softly. I think that has been the hope of Western governments since the 1990s. I think it is a hope that members of the Iranian elite have indulged, particularly Rafsanjani and Rouhani have indulged, because they have always dreamt of splitting the West, the United States off from the Europeans, and also in particular going after European money and investment to make the Islamic Republic a stronger theocracy. So I have zero hope that the regime evolves.
I don't, in that, disagree with what Reul Marc Gerecht has just said. I think for several reasons, maybe slightly different than his. The more we use force or things asymptotic to force and deny, the more we build a strong commitment on the part of Iranians to the regime. And I think it's hard to overcome that. The more we proffer lollipops and even more generous gifts, the more likely the United States is to split itself deeply down the middle, if not worse, in pursuing those kinds of policies, particularly with the Trump administration. Soviet Union was just mentioned. My sense from being there at the time that it was obviously coming to pieces or trying to pick itself up after having come to pieces was there was less of what happened to the Soviet Union influenced by the outside world than what happened by inside the Soviet Union by its own leadership failings. And that's something we can argue about. Every American president has taken seriatim credit for the demise of the Soviet Union, but without, I think, either a good book or a staunch argument for that. And I was there at the time when I think the failure was even worse, because the challenge was what to do post-conflict. And the answers were strategically diverse, not necessarily mutually reinforcing, and in some ways stymied by the notion that was often, I myself was guilty of this, symbolized by what Adam Michnik said, that you can change capitalism into communism. It's like making fish soup out of a fishbowl, but the reverse is not something we know how to do. And I think that that was clearly there. The regime, in my view, has all of the necessary security capacities to hang on. And the more, in fact, that it's under pressure, the more likely it is to have foreign demons to blame and to exalt Iranian nationalism as methods for continuing to try to outrun the course of change. I think, finally, the rather recent history in terms of the last 500 years of U.S. success in regime change has been pretty thin on the ground and pretty short-lived and not very successful. And indeed, one could see the Iranian Revolution as in part generated by a prior action in 1953 in which we participated and which we thought was the final answer to Iran's future and turned out to be sadly mistaken. So I think, the idea that we can instrumentalize a rapid or even long-term change in Iran is subject to a lot of uncertainties. B, the notion that punitive policies can work better than non-punitive policies is a theorem that has, in my view, yet to have a conclusive proof. The idea that we can manage policies and approaches which keep some balance between the two is beyond the capacity of the current administration and maybe future administrations as far as I can see. Third, we have to deal with what we think are our primary interests. And as we look around the world, I can't see regime change meeting the Harry Truman test, U.S. survival and U.S. prosperity.
Barbara Slavin is next on my list.
Thanks very much. Thanks to both of you. We had an event at the Atlantic Council on Friday on how which Ambassador Pickering participated in, on how the uncertainty cast over the Iran nuclear deal by Trump had already kind of reinforced Iranian relations with China and with Russia. So, Reul, if you could explain to me how your policy of essentially sanctioning Europe, forcing Europe to backtrack even more than it has on the Iran deal, is going to help American interests. We've just had, I think, a new national security strategy come out that has identified China and Russia as our key adversaries, and it seems that everything we are doing in regard to Iran is simply pushing them into the laps of Beijing and Moscow. Thanks.
I don't think the Iranians are being pushed into the laps of the Russians. I think the Russians and the Iranians make perfect partners. They have strategic overlaps. They have intellectual overlaps. They can agree on how much they wish to neuter the United States in the Middle East. I think the discussions of the JCPOA are largely irrelevant to that. If the United States were willing to actually push back against the Iranians and the Russians in the Middle East, then this would be a more interesting regional discussion. But since the Trump administration has shown no sign yet that it's willing to do that, then I think the very solid marriage that is taking place, has taken place, is going to last. I think the Trump administration's early approach, which I think has sort of stopped, it's hard to tell because you're dealing with President Trump, that you could separate the Russians and the Iranians, that you could use the Russians against the Iranians, I think was wrong. It was addle-headed. And I'm quite certain that General McMaster did not believe that was true. And I suspect General Mattis also would assent to that. I think that was a policy that came out of the early Trump administration. But one doesn't know for sure. Obviously, the president is slow to criticize Mr. Putin personally, so we don't know whether things could rewind and flip on us. But I suspect that there you're actually going to see some American consistency. How muscular that consistency is, that's a different issue. So, and again, transatlantic relationships are extremely deep. I mean, I consider myself a transatlanticist. I'd like to die on the Route de Cidre and Normandy drinking Calvados. So I don't worry all that much about the transatlantic relationship. I don't get the ties that bind us are far greater than Mr. Trump's problematic behavior. So if we sanction them over the Islamic Republic, they've seen that before. I suspect they will live with it, and the NATO will go on.
Maybe just a comment or two. I think the notion of the irrelevance of Brexit in Reul's mind is obviously
Brexit?
deeply heartening.
Brexit.
Europe is fine, solid, all glued together, totally committed to the United States, never having any particular problems. I leave this particular gathering reinforced in the view that we're smoking something. Secondly, I think it's important to note that at least in part, there are some Russian-Iranian differences. Maybe they're not all that important. One of those is over the acquisition of nuclear weapons. If you really believe Iran is interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, you ought to talk to the Russians about their deep sense of concern, and indeed the way in which they conducted themselves during the JCPOA from time to time put them out ahead of us in terms of hardline views against Iran and its nuclear activities. My own sense is that they're close enough in the neighborhood that these kinds of difficulties are not trivialized, but each is seeking a way to climb on the other's back in one place or another to see how far down the road that they can get. And you're certainly right that anti-USism is a defining, uniting factor in their current policies and where we go, and that we at least bear some share of the responsibility for aiding and abetting that particular course of action. Other than that, I'm totally in agreement with you.
I'm glad to see things are warming up here a little bit in the discussion. We got a question right here.
China. Question of China.
Can you identify yourself?
Barry Blackman. What happens to the relationship between Iran and China? Don't the Chinese take advantage of this for their own?
I mean, I think the Iranians have been exploring the Asia option now for quite some time. They will continue to do so. I don't think that has proven as productive as the Iranians wanted it to be. There was a notion there, particularly when the Europeans became more serious with sanctions, particularly when they brought on the oil embargo in 2012. They thought the Asian option, which had started under Rafsanjani, would be maybe the answer to their Western problems. But as we have discovered, the Iranians actually found out there was a lot of things they didn't really enjoy dealing with in China. The goods they wanted were, they preferred German goods. They loved German goods. They wanted Western products, not Chinese products. Now that could change. I mean, Chinese products could get a lot better. The relationship is obviously still growing with the Chinese. But that happens anyway. I don't think there's anything the United States can do to stop the growth of Iranian-Chinese ties, except by making it possibly painful for the Chinese, where the Chinese just say, it's not worth the effort. The United States, has been very, very poor at sanctioning China for any of its actions. And my view is that I suspect that will continue, that the real truth is it's not we can sanction our Western brothers, but we do have a really hard time going after the Chinese, and I don't expect that to change. I don't think that's pivotal for Iran's hegemonic quest in the Middle East.
Barry, I just would add a little bit that I think the Chinese all along have been very happy to unleash what is clearly small and medium-scale Chinese vendors to make up what the sanctions have kept out, and I think that Reul is right. I think that Chinese, on the other hand, have shown a remarkable hesitancy to put too much of their oil dependency in the Iranian basket. They've sought, obviously, to keep a balance, to increase in a careful way what they depend on Iran for, not to become, put it this way, so overly dependent that the uncertainties that surround Iran, and they certainly do now, would not lead to a cutoff, which they couldn't in one way or another either replace or work their way around in order to obviously continue to be able to run their economy and provide for their national security.
We have a question from Pat Clausen.
Patrick Clausen from the Washington Institute. Could you gentlemen speculate on what Iran would do if Trump walked away from the JCPOA? And even further speculation, what would the Trump administration response be?
Well, let me say I speculated earlier in response to another question, and Reul and I disagree a bit on that, but my sense is their options are really, in fact, to consider the JCPOA dead and operate as if they're no longer bound should we do so, and in the course of do so become the first to materially breach the agreement. And that means they haven't done it before that. And those are the two options that we looked at. One, spin the centrifuges. Two, keep it with the Europeans and the Asians and see if that's an effective way of isolating the United States. And I talked about the reactions to that. We have the DPRK question, I guess. Were it possible, and one wonders, to have an agreement with the DPRK, how would the DPRK feel about making an agreement with a country which is in effect not even using, or maybe we would use, the methods in the agreement itself to walk away from it, but merely walking away from it on the whim of an electoral promise with no basis at all for violating the agreement? What would that say about full faith and credit of the United States in terms of keeping an agreement with North Korea? You know, would you buy a used car from a guy like that?
I just find it amusing thinking about the United States having issues of full faith dealing with North Korea. You can't hear me bellowing. It's an excellent question. I mean, Ali Salehi has actually dealt with this scenario in print. And if Salehi continues to have the ear of the Supreme Leader, and the two gentlemen appear to be fairly close, then the Iranians will play it cool after the Americans either explicitly or de facto move away from the deal. There's also the alternative approach, the hothead approach, which would mean that they would start up, the centrifuges again. They would deploy new centrifuges, enrich beyond, throw out the IAEA, and enrich beyond the 3.9%. I suppose if I'm split on this. If I look into my Persian heart and I say which way they're going to go, my first bet is they'll probably go Salehi's way. But it's also possible that they'll go the other way because they'll want to stick it to us, and they'll want to see if we have the wherewithal to challenge them. I think the Trump factor is still sufficiently alive, despite the fact of his reluctance to counter the Iranians in Iraq and Syria. I think it's probably sufficiently alive that the Iranians won't want to challenge him, which makes Salehi's approach to this the more probable one, that they'll play it out at least initially and see where it goes, see if they can get any of the Europeans to come on board and see what it actually means to them, both strategically and economically.
Our next question is from Don Smith. Right here.
Thank you. I heard from major Israeli officials maybe 6-7 years ago that the sanctions at that time on Iran were having an effect of reducing their GDP by 35 to 40%. Do I have this on?
Yeah, sounds good.
First of all,
We can hear you anyway, Don.
yeah, first of all, is that true? And secondly, if it is, or even if it's not, if we had kept the sanctions on instead of engaging in the agreement we did, would we have squeezed them to some result? And what would have that result been? And that's a forerunner of the question I have today, which is if we reestablish sanctions, including sub-sanctions on the Europeans, can we achieve any objective that would be in our interest?
Let me say that I don't know the 35 figure. Others at the table may know. I think it's a little high, but that is just a horseback judgment. I think on the question of could we achieve a better result by reimposing sanctions, perhaps if in fact the international community were prepared to go along with us. It was quite clear, however, at the end of the JCPOA they were satisfied with the agreement. 3 of the 4 ambassadors from the permanent members of the Security Council went to the Congress and said that were the Congress to seek, or the President to impose more sanctions as a way of, quote, improving the JCPOA, they could not count on those countries joining us in those sanctions, which would have been a big rift, and that would, I think, have cascaded into perhaps nobody joining us in those sanctions. So it's a little theoretical, Don, I think, to ask the question, because the answer is that it's probably not obtainable. And that, I think, still prevails as the view. Were we to unilaterally materially breach the agreement by failing to abide by it, the principal action there would be not to denounce it, but to failure to waive the sanctions. Then I think they would be very much on the line of seeing whether they could pick up the soft answer and keep the agreement with Iran and let us be isolated. And I think that NATO and the European Union would be perfectly happy with that outcome.
I mean, that's a good question. It's a hard question to answer. I mean, I defer to Patrick on the statistics that we can actually trust. I have a hard time dealing with, and I read a lot of them, Iranian numbers, because I'm never quite sure whether they know what they're talking about. I would just say one of my first encounters with Patrick was, almost 20 years ago in Paris, where there were members of the Iranian Office of Budget, and Patrick got up there and gave a description of what the Iranian economy and the Iranian budget was like. And I remember the Iranian officials went up to him and said, "How do you know this? Because this is better than what we know." So, this is a tricky issue. I mean, there's a lot of internal Iranian commentary that suggests that the economic crisis was worse than what you suggest. I just don't know. I'm not sure of what to believe. My skepticism is just too high here. They were in pain. They were in severe pain.
Where would that have led, if we had continued?
Would you let me just make a point
Sure.
here very quickly, because they were in pain, and I agree, but they were in pain for 3 reasons. One was Ahmadinejad had screwed up the economy, so the additional nuclear sanctions that came during the course of Ahmadinejad's period in time were useful in putting extra spin on the screwed up economy. And then, lest we forget, there was that great gift of Allah, the oil price decline internationally, maybe God's gift to fracking or whatever. But it was certainly a major blow to oil producers, and Iran was not, minimally affected by that. So in effect, the sanctions played a role, I think maybe even a significant role, but not the exclusive role.
Yeah, I would agree with most of that. I do think that the primary agent of really messing the Iranians up, and the Iranians talk about this themselves, are really the unilateral American sanctions. That and SWIFT. So the real muscle here wasn't actually the European complement, though it was great that they went along with the oil embargo. Is the Americans were willing to go somewhere that they had not been willing to go before, which was the financial sanctions and central bank sanctions, because there had been a lot of resistance in the Washington establishment and New York to central bank sanctions against anybody. Syria, I believe, historically is the breakthrough there. Patrick can remind me whether I've got that chronology correct. So where they would have gone, I don't know. I mean, my view is it's always good to impoverish your enemy. So the more money you can take from them, that's totally separate from the nuclear deal. I get actually a little bored talking about the nuclear deal because I don't consider it the primary issue. So I would argue it's a good idea to take money from them. Now, whether it would lead to regime collapse, I don't know. I actually don't care. I'm not really a Marxist at heart. I don't believe that man is Homo economicus. I believe that there are other issues that are preeminent, that really move men more powerfully and sustain them. So, but
Like religion?
Oh, absolutely. But God is under strain in the Islamic Republic. I mean, the one great thing about the Islamic Republic, compared to, say, the Arab lands of the Middle East, is that you have this incredibly talkative religious hierarchy. So you can actually get a decent idea of what's going on inside of the Shiite clergy in Iran. You can't get a perfect idea, but you can get a decent idea. And God and man are under severe stress in that country. That's a good thing.
Well, now we have a question from David Pollack, back in the rear on the right.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. Dave Pollack from the Washington Institute. Thank you for good discussion. All right. Reul, you mentioned, I counted 3 times when you said that the Trump administration, despite its rhetoric, has not been serious so far about trying to counter Iran's regional activities.
Only 3.
Non-nuclear.
Only 3.
Yeah, so, 3. So 4th time is the charm. I want to ask you, I agree with that, but I want to ask you what you would recommend that the United States could or should do to counter Iran's regional activities, quite apart from the JCPOA, which I agree is boring. And for Ambassador Pickering, same question to you. You didn't even mention, I think, trying to counter any of Iran's regional activities, whether in Syria, Iraq, the Gulf, Yemen, terrorism, Hezbollah, and so on and so on. Is there anything that you think we could or should do about any of that? Thank you.
You want to go first?
Okay, I mean, put it quickly. I'd go. I always go where my opponent is signaling me to go, which in Iran's case is Syria. So I would follow, in the beginning, I'd follow sort of the approach that I believe General Petraeus has sent privately to the president, and that Fred Kagan are in favor of, and that is a much more substantial American military force in Syria. And I would seek to punish the Iranians for their actions there, to make them bleed. But that requires a certain intestinal fortitude, because the Russians took advantage of the American vacuum, and they are there, and we are not. For us to do anything, you're going to have to use mach politique. There's no way around this. You don't get to have a soft power approach to Syria. So that means we're there. That means we're going to be there for a while. And that means the president would have to eat some of the rhetoric of his campaign, which I find highly unlikely on this issue. So I don't foresee a change. The other thing the Americans might be able to do, it would be a tough call because MBS is obviously a very hard-charging young man, is that I would try to get the Saudis to stop doing what they're doing in Yemen. I believe that is enormously counterproductive. It's not a foregone conclusion that the Houthis are going to go the way of the Hezbollah, but if they keep this war up, I think the odds of the Hezbollahization of Yemen are sufficiently serious to cause us grave concern. Because mark my words, what the Iranians are going to aim at, that's the whole idea behind their successful effort, which is historically unparalleled, to create these Shiite militias that are now tens of thousands strong, is to go after the oppressed Shia of the eastern province in Bahrain. They are definitely going to go there. If the Saudis are so stupid as to pave the path for them, then at least we could try to discourage the Saudis from accelerating or what has been a really pretty low-cost effort by the Iranians in Yemen.
3 or 4 quick points. I agree with Reul both on Yemen and the eastern province Shia and in Bahrain. I think, and we should watch Kuwait carefully. I think that the second point is that I did mention ballistic missile testing, because I think we should put more emphasis on that, even though a missile without an effective nuclear warhead, while still an important and significant weapon, is not the one that we're most concerned with, and that the strategy we adopted with dealing with that, I think, is right. 2 years before the Russians went in with air and ground forces, I was advocating here in town that we should stop the Syrian Air Force flying by the simple statement that we were going to use our Air Force where we wanted, when we wanted, any time we wanted, over all of Syria. And it would be very dangerous for fixed and rotary wing Syrian aircraft to ever fly in Syria. And we should have been prepared to back that up. We lost an enormous advantage in Syria by not having and continuing to maintain air dominance. And it would have been a hell of a lot harder for Putin to move into that situation had we done so and maintained it for a time when we had an absolutely free ride to do that with no consequences. I'm not sure how and in what way that would have affected Iranian presence, other than we could have reinforced places where Hezbollah was fighting Syrian opposition in a much more effective way than we chose to do. And that was not, in my view, an irrevocable mark of unfettered mission creep getting us deep into a ground war in the region. Putin taught us something serious, that the use of force to support diplomatic objectives is a very legitimate and very important part of our national armamentarium. What we have forgotten in North Korea is the use of force without diplomacy almost always ends up in more use of force without diplomacy.
Well, this is a very highbrow discussion, and we're using words like armamentarian. You know, you read these words.
Asymptotic.
I know.
That was good. Asymptotic
I
was
usually
good.
get in trouble using these words, so I'm glad to hear someone else. Our next question
Jacob, you're an editor. Come on.
is from,
Would he have cut asymptotic? That's what I want to know.
is one of our stalwart contributors, especially on Syria, Lincoln Bloomfeld. There he is.
Thanks. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Jacob. I think I'm going to repeat the same question, but a different way. Because let's start with the JCPOA. It stopped the pathways to the bomb. It put the threat of a strike against Iran off into the future. The other half of the JCPOA, the tacit part, was what President Obama articulated at the UN in 2013, the hope that Iran and the U.S. would respect each other's interests. And this is what Rouhani and Zarif have been promoting, and people have been advocating inside Washington as well, that let's let this play out and see what happens. You've talked about President Trump, but you really haven't talked, you've only mentioned McMaster, Mattis, Tillerson's hardly been mentioned. Can I just say a word about their agenda in the Middle East and then ask you about Iran? So in Yemen, for example, there's great pressure to have a diplomatic process to end the war, maybe to bring the Houthis to the table, but you have these ballistic missile firings into Saudi Arabia. Can we get a process successfully launched and finished? We're trying to rebuild Syria and Iraq, but under current circumstances, that's difficult. We're working with Russia on the sort of southwestern border of Jordan. That seems to be holding, but in the northeast, it's tough. And Turkey's at the table in Astana with Iran, but not with us. And now we're sort of tangling over the one place that the State Department feels we might be able to interject the Iranian bridge to the Levant from the Iranian border. And so, you know, Tillerson has given a serious speech. He wants to see Assad go under a UN-sponsored process. That's our aspiration. Kuwait wants to have a rebuilding conference. We want Gulf money. Qatar has broken away from the quartet. There's Iranian influence there. So my question to you is, if you just look at the American policy agenda, such as it is, around the Middle East, I didn't mention Hariri and the problems in Lebanon. A, do you agree that Iran is a factor? I think we all know the answer to that. And B, you've said that we haven't done anything about it. You've given a couple of ideas on what we might do, but how do we advance? Do we have any chance of advancing the U.S. policy, and do we care if we don't?
I think the answer to your first question is clear. The answer to your second question is the administration seems to be so tying itself up into knots and so clearly divorcing any diplomatic effort with any significance in places like Syria or Yemen as to leave me to believe that even a policy of somehow limiting damage is beyond the capacity of the United States and its much vaunted but now seemingly totally past leadership to take on. I wish, in fact, that the points you made were somehow absorbed by the administration and integrated into a strategy that continued to, in fact, use our serious capabilities to combine, as I said a moment ago, force with diplomacy to get the kind of answers that may be within reach here. But I see absolutely no focus, attention, capacity, or even interest to move in these areas.
I mean, to just restate what I did before, unless you see a willingness on the United States to use force, then the diplomacy is only a pathway to surrender. So there's got to be some willingness to take the Iranians and the Russians on, and I don't see any willingness to do so. And you know, I mean, there were lots of discussions out there about how to pivot from going after Islamic State to bringing pressure on the Iranians. The administration has had those discussions. I suspect they've had the discussions to the point that, you know, General McMaster and Joel Rayburn's eyes are falling out. But it doesn't really matter if nothing ever develops, because ultimately the president has no desire to commit further U.S. forces. So I don't see the possibilities for U.S. diplomacy being successfully deployed until you see a willingness of the United States to commit itself and to bleed. So, you know, we're still in the shadow of Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't see that changing. I mean, even the administration discussions, and I don't know where they are, about reducing U.S. forces in Iraq makes sense to some extent. I mean, if the forces are only so large as to allow you to be held hostage, but are not large enough to allow you to coerce, then you're in a bad situation. So, you know, I think the I think the administration is in a conundrum here. But I think it's a conundrum that, by the way, is not unique to the Trump administration. It afflicts both the Democratic and Republican parties. I don't see that much difference between the parties now on the use of force in the Middle East.
But let me say how much I agree with you. The really interesting question, at our maximum truth strength in both countries, we saw no real capacity to move the question ahead to any kind of exit strategy or solution that in any way at all I thought recommended itself. I can remember the great General Schwarzkopf at Safwan so screwing up the beginning of the end of the war in the first Gulf War that we never were able to recover it. We're terrific at combat. We're really crappy at integrating combat and diplomacy, and we're terrible at ending conflicts. Other than that, we're terrific.
That's been our pattern since World War II. Raymond Tanter from Georgetown University.
Well, it's actually University of Michigan. I'm not at Georgetown anymore, but
Then there's something wrong with our...
I understand. I'll update that. Reul, as a former case officer at the agency, would you agree with Mike Pompeo's statement that he thinks that the revolts will continue? Now, I'm not sure that that's a formal assessment of the agency or the other intelligence agencies, but that's the question I have. If they're going to continue, it's like the burning bush in the Sinai desert that at the top it continues to burn, but it's not clear when the fire will start. And to Ambassador Pickering, whom I backed up when I was on the NSC staff, I had your back. My feeling is that when President Trump rules out diplomacy, that strengthens his hand for Tillerson's hand for diplomatic action later. Why do I say that? I say that because it's Kim Jong-un who's sending people to the United States in order to test the waters to find out what Trump is trying to do beyond what his intelligence agencies are doing. They're going around to think tanks, interviewing people like Patrick and others. I don't know whether that's true or not, though, with respect to what Trump is likely to do. So I think that from the point of view of playing the game of chicken, Kim is likely to blink more than Trump.
Professor Tanner, I agree with you, and the question is, when is ripe time? And diplomacy does not succeed in an instant moment of its declaration. It takes a long, hard slog.
With diplomats on the ground.
Absolutely. And if you want to use up all your leverage in scaring the S out of the other side so you can receive your surrender, then your trust in the tooth fairy is well above mine.
Reul, any?
I think I answered that question, though I would preface it by saying that anytime there is any type of official CIA statement, and if I find myself in agreement with it, I get incredibly nervous, and I want to reassess what I've said. And I could go into detail about that, but I won't, personal level. But you know, it's a constant. The boil's there. The boil's not going away. The Islamic Republic is philosophically unstable. All right, and this does not change. It was born of two different aspirations: theocracy and democracy. They are at war with each other. And as the Ayatollah, late Ayatollah Mahdavi Khani put it more than 30 years ago, if Islam is about everything, it's about nothing. The regime is secularizing Iranian society, and it's an untenable situation for them. Eventually, it's got to blow, and it's got to blow at a level that the regime security forces, which are very good, cannot sustain, cannot handle. So far, the security forces have been able to do it, but I just remind folks that the number of people who are actually in the Basij who are capable of being deployed and in the Revolutionary Guard Corps that are capable of being deployed are much smaller than I think a lot of people realize. And if there's anything we learned from 2009 is that after 2009, and it continues into 2010, the Supreme Leader engages in musical chairs with the command positions in the Revolutionary Guard Corps. I don't think he did that because he had confidence in them. I think he did that because he was uncertain about them, that the Revolutionary Guard Corps itself had revealed in 2009 that there were units that did not want to participate in killing Iranians. Now, they were able to hit hard elsewhere. They used tactics that they had not used before, including rape, and it shocked the system of the children of the elite, who, by the way, are the ones who were leading the revolt. So those tactics, those methods worked. Will they continue to work? I don't know. I count myself skeptical because, again, you go back to the figure on university graduates, the regime has created an institution that is in fact killing itself.
I accept and agree with your skepticism. Was it Einstein who once said to keep on doing the same thing and expect a result is not the definition of sanity?
Well, we have a final question. We may not be heading towards finality with Iran, but we are heading toward the finish line of this session. Matt Reisner from the Center for the National Interest.
Hi. If the JCPOA is withdrawn from by the United States, and if Iran is then in turn perceived correctly or otherwise as sort of resuming its push towards nuclear weapons, I'm curious if either of our panelists have a sense of how other Middle Eastern countries might react to those developments. For example, there have been discussions in recent months about Saudi Arabia potentially increasing their own domestic nuclear capabilities. And I'm curious if the perception that the United States kind of sabotaged its own strategy in dealing with Iran might cause these countries to adapt sort of new ways to try to navigate the uncertainty about Iran's nuclear program, or if they might kind of just revert back to the positions that they've held on that program basically over the past couple decades.
Look, I think that's a very good question, if I can just jump into it. And I think that while the timelines are so vastly different between May 12th and spinning centrifuges and Saudi Arabia acquiring a nuclear potential which over time would lead it to have weapons. It's not totally, in my view, out of the question that either side of the JCPOA, we have to be honest about that, could be used to explain a move on the part of Middle Eastern countries, UAE and Saudi Arabia, to buy, and we've often worried about a Pakistani weapon for sale, or to buy technology or otherwise import on a fast-track basis from someplace. The capacity to go there may be Pakistan. The one side being we get out and it falls apart and centrifuges spin. The other side is a much more subtle one, which I wrote an article that I referred to earlier designed to try to take care of, that allowing countries to enrich even on a selective basis without full control over that enrichment and where it goes has its own consequences, which we've tried to face up to in the JCPOA. And I think in both cases one could use that argument on either side of the coin to try to drive a Saudi, UAE, whatever program. And the 123 agreement, about which Bob Einhorn just wrote a very interesting article, is clearly moving in that direction. And Bob, in his own view, presents a kind of graduated program which would restrict the Saudis for an early period of time, but open up wider freedom to enrich for a longer period of time. And my sense is that the gold standard ought to be Iran. But if we need a capacity on the part of other countries to use enrichment for their own or for palpable sale in an open market of LEU, we ought to do one or two things. We ought to multinationalize enrichment plants so there would be full revelation about production and offtake and sale. And we ought to organize under the IAEA international fuel bank storage for surplus LEU. And we should pursue, wherever it's possible, the conversion of LEU in gaseous form to fuel elements or to pellets that can be used in fuel elements, so reversibility is technologically set back for a long period of time. More than you really wanted to know.
Any thoughts? Or you?
I was just listening. It's hard for me to take the Saudis seriously. You know, I think if the Saudi approach to this would be to pull out stock footage of Pakistani planes landing in Riyadh. Maybe they can get the Pakistanis to actually land in Riyadh and suggest that they've taken delivery of nuclear weapons. And I suspect that's the Saudi way. They are so far behind the Iranians, and so are the Emiratis, and just the technical base, educational base, everything, that they obviously need somebody else. The Israelis are what we're talking about here. Would the Israelis do something? I don't know. The Israelis have obviously a throw weight problem. They don't have enough aircraft. So it's and certainly for them to strike and strike efficiently, it would be problematic. Now that isn't necessarily a reason why they wouldn't do it. I mean, you can make arguments for why, even if the Israelis cannot bomb with the level of destructiveness that we are capable of, doesn't mean they still won't try to do it. But it would be a significant challenge for the Israeli Air Force, which is why the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli intelligence community have expressed somewhat openly their skepticism of their capacity to undertake such a mission.
That's an Iranian mission.
Excuse me.
An Iranian mission.
In Iran, yes,
Yes.
To go after the
Bibi would love to hold our coat.
the nuclear, yeah, exactly, the nuclear facilities. So again, I don't want to suggest, I think it's a mistake if you look at Israeli practices historically to believe that just because you think they can't do it doesn't mean they won't do it. But it would be a truly, truly challenging affair for them. But they're the only ones in the Middle East that could do this. The notion of the Sunni Arabs coming together, I think, is pretty weak, and that we are back to where we were, and it was inevitable this was going to happen. We're back to where we were essentially in the 10th century of Islamic history. There are two peoples that matter in the classical Middle East. They are Turks and they are Iranians. The Arabs are a sideshow.
Well, on that emphatic note, I would like to thank our speakers for their excogitations and for participating today.